Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Trusted Energy, Forecasting Our Uncertain Future. The topic of tonight's event is energy forecasting. And we are privileged, first of all, tonight to have such a wonderful array of speakers. We've got Rembrandt Coppola from Imperial College London. We have Jed Davis from the World Energy Council and Joe Coleman from Shell, who will all be bringing and have worked in their own respects in energy forecasting and scenario planning over the years. So we should have a diverse range of opinions, and we should have a great source of information to create some useful takeaways today, takeaways back to our families and also to our workplaces, and change the way we only think about energy forecasting. As for why the future energy leaders are involved tonight, why we think this is a discussion worth having, largely the future energy leaders are comprised of individuals who have, whether we were born in the late 80s, early 90s, we've grown up in the context of an energy transition. We are the energy transition generation, if you'd like to say it that way. I myself was actually born in the year that the United Nations created its framework convention on climate change. So many of us coming into our lives and coming into our careers thinking about energy have been seeing that there's always going to be some sort of transition coming, and that maybe the way we could produce energy at the moment needs to have some serious thought. One of the key goals of the Future Energy Leaders group is to drive towards a sensible energy future. And that begs the question, who gets to define what sensible energy future looks like? And that question largely is significantly contributed to by energy forecasting. And so that's the ideas that we want to start unpacking in this session tonight. How do we use forecasts in the best available way? And how do we generate something that is going to be useful in our daily lives and the actions that we take going forward? Just to give a little bit of context to the discussion, some initial ideas about the energy transition. This may well be the largest and fastest energy transition in human history. I don't think that is an overstatement. This is a part of our emissions pathway over the last 30 years. As you can see, it's been a relatively upwards trend. And this needs to change. These pathways are plotted out for different years, depending on which year we start. It needs to change quite abruptly if we're to meet the Paris climate goals of 2 degrees Celsius. If you're familiar with the 2 degrees number, it's essentially how much warming we're able to give the world without, so we can prevent ourselves from having the worst of the climate change related effects. So as you can see, the longer we delay or the longer we continue to increase our emissions, the faster this transition is going to have to be to meet those goals. So there's a fast change coming, there's an abrupt change coming, and we need to think quite carefully about what this is going to look like. And we need to start thinking now. Unfortunately, in the area of forecasting, you tend to have the case when you have rapid transitions that forecasts aren't necessarily, they don't always keep up. So over the past years, we've had some situations where the forecasts have performed relatively poorly in the context of the actual transitions that occurred. This particular plot shows solar uptake over the past, since about 2000. The black dotted line is representing actual solar installation capacity, and each of the curved lines you can see drawn off that black line represent the forecast made at that particular time, what the future would look like. So as you can see, as the years went on, forecasting continued increasing, but what it meant is that today, actual installed solar capacity is significantly larger, order of magnitude larger than we thought we would have back in the early 2000s. If we have forecasts like this, we need to think of how our forecasts are being used. Are they a prediction of the future, or are they just a way of us thinking about forecasts or thinking about our energy system and how the future mix of energy is going to be planned out? These are some of the ideas and things we want to unpack, because a lot of the time when a reputable institution puts forward an energy forecast or puts forward a particular scenario, often the case is that people see that scenario and they think that that's what the future will look like. So in some respects, these sort of forecasts can be self-fulfilling as well. But in any case, that's just a little bit of context around what we're going to be discussing this evening. I'd like to now just ask our speakers to come up just individually for about 5 minutes, introduce themselves, introduce their organization, its relation to energy forecasting, and just some ideas and opinions about tonight's event.
Great. Good evening. So my name's Jo Coleman, and I am the Energy Transition Manager for Shell in the UK. And I'm going to share with you some of the work that at Shell we do to try and understand the complex environment in which we operate in, and how we as Shell can thrive through the energy transition. But first, a little bit of context. We all, of course, Shell is not an unknown company to you, but a bit of context in the UK. So Shell has multiple businesses globally, and they're pretty much all active in the UK. We employ 5,500 people in the UK. We produce roughly 10% of UK oil and gas production, and we deliver 20% of the UK's gas supply. And we have roughly 5 million customers a week to our retail service stations, and we fuel about 600 aircraft a day. And as of the back end of last year, we also supply power and gas to around 850,000 homes in the UK through our acquisition of First Utility. And it's my role within them to basically understand and to support each of Shell's businesses in maximising the opportunity that the energy transition offers, and also to make sure that opportunities within the energy transition that perhaps fall between the businesses or we don't have a business in are also being, if you like, supported and promoted through the Shell system. And it's also my role to make sure that Shell in the UK is developing plans and actions that support Shell's global ambition to reduce its net carbon footprint by 20% by 2035, which is in line with society's needs to deliver the climate change goals of Paris. So I guess I don't have a crystal ball, though, to know what the challenges are that the businesses are going to face. And to be perfectly honest, neither does anybody else. So in Shell, we use scenarios to try and help us navigate this uncertainty in the future. And Shell has been developing scenarios and delivering scenarios for almost 50 years. And we've continued to do so. And you know, Jed's a previous head of the scenarios team in the UK, but we've continued to do so because we find them useful. We find them useful to help inform our business decisions, to navigate uncertainty that perhaps can't be forecast, you know, things that you will not find it coming out of any typical forecast. So we ask like kind of what if and how questions. We don't try to predict, we're not trying to have a forecast, and often our scenarios are not really focused on numbers that much either. I went back to some that are potentially from Jed's day, and I couldn't find any numbers in them virtually. They're all words. You know, it's more about painting a picture and having a story about different business environments more than it is about having some absolute numbers and forecasts to follow. But of course, there is a bit of modelling involved. And this idea of painting a picture and using a scenario to do so is very much what we try to do in our scenarios called Mountains and Oceans. So these are scenarios that explore different socio-political pathways with energy demand and emissions as almost open-ended outcomes of that. So they're not goal-seeking in that respect. It's about having that sort of mixture of some analysis, some strategic thinking, some dialogue, and how you merge that together in a story. But Shell's more recent scenario, called Sky, takes a different approach, and that is a goal-driven or what's called a normative approach to a scenario. And Sky outlines, it's a complicated set of words here, but a technologically, industrially, and economically possible route to deliver the goals required of the Paris Agreement. And it's intended to be ambitious, but it's also intended to be a route for dialogue. So I'm talking about scenarios, I suspect Jed will as well. How do scenarios differ from forecasts? Well, I think firstly, we're not trying to predict the future. That's not the intent of a scenario, it's to explore possibilities. And in that respect, a scenario can't have a low or a medium or a high scenario because then it is a forecast. But of course, we do use forecasts like that, and we use them when we think about things like oil price. We use them when we think about the production from an oil and gas reservoir. That has a forecast, and it has a high, a low, and a medium forecast often. But I guess the other thing is that forecasting is predicated on the idea that the uncertainties can all be understood and captured within a model. So we think of forecasting as things like weather forecasting, We've got really, really good at weather forecasting over the last couple of decades. And so we can forecast now 10 days out, often very, very accurately. But every so often, something happens. You know, there's a black swan event, and the forecasters just can't do it anymore. You know, they've got such a wide range of outcomes. And at Shell, we would argue that, you know, that is the situation we face when we think about the future energy system a lot of the time. I'm not suggesting that everything is entirely random, but it isn't entirely predictable either. And there are black swan events. And what you just described, Jacob, in the, you know, about solar, that is something that very few people predicted. But I went back to our scenarios actually in Shell and looked at, again, from Jed's day, some of the views. And we'd actually predicted, we're a little bit under on the solar. Well, we hadn't predicted it, but the numbers in the scenario had a bit less solar than we're showing today, but actually had way more wind in them than we're showing today. So we weren't, you know, downbeat on renewables. But I mean, that brings me on to how do we produce scenarios? So we produce them in-house. We've got a team of you know, policy, social scientists, and energy experts, but we also very much like to work and listen to others. And I know that's one of the questions for later. So we worked with MIT on Sky to test our assumptions about what was required for climate change. We worked with the Nature Conservancy to understand the land-based afforestation requirements. And we use the IEA scenarios as well. So I guess I'd like to finish with a bit of a quote. And when I looked this up to make sure I could get it right, the guy who made this quote was called George Box, and he was described as a famous statistician. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think there can be a famous statistician. But anyway, George said that all models are wrong, but some tell you something useful. And, you know, since forecasts are derived from models, you can argue that forecasts will always be wrong. We don't try and make forecasts for the energy future. We try and make scenarios, and we don't make them to be right or to have an exact prediction, but we do hope that they're useful. We find them useful in Shell, and we also hope they're useful to others in academia, in industry, and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. That was very inspiring to start with. So my name is Rembrandt Coppola. I'm a recent graduate from Imperial College, in the sense that I finished an energy systems modeling PhD, which looking at kind of power plant scenarios for the Netherlands, UK, and Germany. And I now have a job which looks at managing an Internet of Things energy sensor program for solar and for biogas in East Africa and in India. At least that's our target first markets. And that looks at maintenance and finance options. But next to that, we also work on something called the Poor People's Energy Outlook, which gives a kind of global overview of something that's often not taken into account in lots of detail, because currently it does focus on people who don't use energy and how they can get more access to energy. So if we think about the scenario world, there are lots of areas which are, in essence, often underexplored, because you only have so much time and resources to do something. So that's one part of what we look on is, okay, what if a lot of people who currently don't have energy suddenly get access to electricity? What would happen in the future around that? Would it get access to cars, petroleum, modern forms of fuel, renewables, and what are the scenarios there? Now, one of the reasons, so based on kind of my academic background, in my feeling, just looking a bit of kind of question, why is forecasting important? And I think at this point in time, we're trying to do two things. We're trying to have, based on my experience, based on that we're looking mostly at strategic decisions, and to an extent, academics mostly in the UK are trying to get scenarios to really push individual technology options. And so far, that's kind of failed. So you have your kind of scenario model, your optimization model behind it, lots of mathematics, and it looks at, okay, we need these 3, 4, 5 technology options to meet our carbon targets. And what we see happening around that is that certain options in all the calculations from multiple institutes see, for instance, carbon capture and storage is a requirement to meet the targets. And what the idea behind that is that we use these scenarios to explore what are the technology mixes and options that are needed, and that will then be handed over to politicians in the UK to support those programs in collaboration with companies. But often what happens so far by experience is that those options are not taken up. There's the famous example here is the carbon capture and storage pilots, which were planned, the tenders were granted, and then the money was pulled as the next government came in. And this is an example of a situation of a country which actually has a very good energy expertise background, lots of civil servants who have a lot of experience in energy scenarios. They use their own energy scenario models for the UK. And so it's a very good grounding bet where you could actually have this kind of more called technocratic or more very quantitatively and qualitatively scenario-driven approach versus countries like the Netherlands, where I'm originally from, which don't have any in-house knowledge in the civil service of the scale of the UK at all. So that's where I think we're sort of trying to push scenarios to become more useful in that way, but we're missing the structure of the organization to make that happen. But that could be another relevant aspect for scenarios. Then another problem there, challenge there, I think, which I wanted to lay on the table is that I think often also it's a challenge of understanding what the scenario is about. And that's really different depending on what you look at. So we already heard the word normative from Joanna, and some scenarios are normative in the sense that they set a certain goal and what do you need to do to reach that goal. Whereas other scenarios are much more loose, open-ended. They have some starting driving assumptions, and then they look at what happens. And I think that's really different, and it's difficult to understand what the boundary conditions are. And that's the way of lack of transparency often on how scenarios are published, what the underlying assumptions are, and how we can communicate about that and use them as a discussion tool. I think that's a really relevant, fruitful area of talking about. Now, in terms of like kind of questions that I think are relevant for scenarios and forecasting is not necessarily how we can create better forecasts. I really found that what Joanna was saying about the forecast is not about trying to create forecasts that will actually happen. It's about how can we create more useful forecasts for discussions and for plotting decisions, and especially from a kind of what-if perspective. And how can we point down which what-ifs are relevant? So I think that's a key question here. What are the what-ifs that are relevant and we need to really look at and zoom in and get more detail on? Because you can employ 100 or 500 people to look at every single bit. The International Energy Agency tries to do that with a very limited budget relative to what the scope that's needed. They have some of the most expert people in the world have been doing this, and they also miss out on a lot of things. So you really need to have some kind of pre-scoping on that. And then how can we kind of improve transparency around this thinking? I think it will be very helpful between organizations and improve the transparency, especially between academia and business. I think that's just to strengthen that. I'm not so sure about government, mainly because government likes to be, to an extent, in my experience in working with more of an ivory tower on models and scenarios than business likes to be. So not sharing information or data unless it's vetted, because it's actually used in decision making, and this has to do with, it might be in the newspaper or something that somebody did something stupid kind of thing. There's an inherent bias not to work on that. And then the other thing is, how can you link more technical experts on disruptive technologies to be helpful to inform those what-if scenarios? Those are kind of my opening remarks of what I think is relevant. Thank you.
I think in terms of my own interest in the area, I think it's simple to say I've been a scenario practitioner. Sounds a long time now, probably for well over 40 years. And I've worked with a lot of different institutions, which are partly related to my initial career in Shell, but since then working with quite a number of and significant variety of international institutions. I come here as the executive chair of scenarios at the World Energy Council. I think I should perhaps give you a sense of what the World Energy Council is. It's a membership organization. If you think of the Olympic Committee, each country has an Olympic committee, and there is a secretariat that sort of looks after the collective interest. In a way, the World Energy Council consists of nearly 100 member committees, 100 countries around the world. And they are immensely various in terms of the challenges and issues that they have to face. But they are the source of the bedrock of what the World Energy Council is. It's made up of more than 3,000 organizations. It's very active in dealing with governments, particularly outside the OECD, where there's a very strong ministerial interest, also, to be fair, within as well. And it has people from industry, academia. It has a significant set of NGOs. And you could say that one of its challenges and one of its responsibilities is to try to help us better understand where the energy industry is going. Perhaps it's worth declaring my position up front about, I noticed the words trust and energy forecast actually close to each other, I think. I'm very much of the school that anybody who says to you they can foretell the future is lying. However, that doesn't mean to say we can't do some remarkably interesting things with foresight. And that is what I want to talk to you about, the possibilities. And I'm going to give you some content because I think content matters, and we saw a little bit of it earlier. First of all, let's touch on something that Rembrandt raised earlier. It's quite useful to separate out. This is a set of recent studies. The show one is on plausible, the sky. You see a little bracket in there that says normative approach. But by and large, different organizations have quite different approaches. Plausible means the development of futures which are very plausible, but may be immensely challenging to the present. And I'll give you a concrete example. Probable, the mainstream IEA work presumes we have a model of the world that we can project forward. Now, of course, it's more than a model. They do a large amount of very detailed analysis of the supply structures, how demand will develop, shifts in policy. So all of that is particularly important. And this is, we've just completed this as one of the inputs to a current review of our own work going into 2019. And preferable, you mentioned normative. Well, it's probably fair to say, and particularly go back to work I know well, going back 20 years, began to move significantly into the normative area because we were interested in what are the pathways that will lead us to a world of global warming increase no more than 2 degrees centigrade, and ideally targeting, let's say, the Paris Accords of 1.5. And bearing in mind, because reality always sort of butts in from time to time, the governments, even coming out of Paris, if you take their collective pledges, we're only looking at around 3.2, 3.3 degrees centigrade. Right, so there's an immense amount to do beyond the existing targets. And immediately you can see one of the central issues. Energy's future is not determined by energy. It's not about technology just. It's not about the perspectives of individual energy companies. These are large-scale collective issues that impact on society, have fundamental political ramifications, affect our very mindsets in terms of the possible and our preferences. Now, raise the question, which is quite fundamental in looking forward, is what world would I like to see? What world will I be part of creating in the things that I do? So the future is an immensely powerful space in which to invest our dreams, possibilities, but scenario work is about also forcing concrete realities to come in and honoring very wide sets of different perspectives. So let's talk about something quite concrete. I'll come back to these towards the end. I want to say a little bit about how the World Energy Council develops its work and to give you a sense of some of the content. I think the first thing that's important is this is not work that's done by an expert team. The work that we do is deliberately structured, that we work with large groups interactively and help them to appreciate what is shaping the world of energy. And we do this around the world. So what the Chinese government thinks, we work with a number of Chinese institutions, is very different There's a base set of views as Northern Europe compared with the Kenyan villages or Latin American situations. So variety is part and parcel nature of the future of global energy. We work in workshops. We don't only have our own members, but we'll bring in relevant experts. And what we're looking for is not what I would say learned expertise. We're looking for fundamental insight. People who've got a particular way of looking, which seems intuitively to be important to have in the mix somehow. And sometimes these are people with very different views of where energy is or should go than you might expect traditionally. We have a number of partners, in particular because we do large-scale computation. We work with, it could be other institutions, but the Punkt Institute in Switzerland, who are a key part of the team, and also with Accenture Strategy. Accenture is a large consulting organization, and we work particularly on leading edge issues around digitalization and new technologies, and trying to find new tools to better assess the implications for energy. So let's imagine, here we are. This is where we were when we produced this work two years or so before 2016, so 2014, 2-year process. The first thing, which is immensely important in the style of scenarios that the World Energy Council does, and it's inherited in a way from the way Shell does this work, is to be very clear about what is forecastable and what do you think is critically uncertain. Knowing what is forecastable, and this is a position you take, rather than leaving it woolly, being clear about what's forecastable is terribly important, because it's saying something about what you have to do in any world, regardless of the societal, political developments, economic issues. In the work that we entered into, there were a number of pretty critical ones, and pointing at how dramatically different the world going forward would be from the past. And going forward, and we can discuss this later, the time horizon you choose is extremely important. The metabolism, as it were, of large-scale systems is immensely variable, and particularly the energy system, where we can have commitments, concrete on the ground, power stations, which may have to last for, if you take hydro plants, up to 100 years or more. So there's a long-lived metabolism. If you want to put a nuclear plant on the ground in some countries where it's still allowed, you may have to wait up to 15 years to go through all of the approvals to have that happen. So there's a metabolism of the energy system that's important to recognize. I think I'll just list these quickly because of time. Number one is demography. We're looking at much slower growth in populations going through to, in case of this work, 2060. That matters. Come from a world, the last 45 years was 1.7% per annum. We're looking, if you take the UN mid-rate, at around 0.7%. Low population growth has very important implications for the potential for economic growth. I think secondly, absolutely radical is the emergence of a new set of technologies. Some people refer to the fourth. Many analysts of industrial revolution refer to the fifth. I think what matters to us is what it is. And here it's important because energy, as it has in the last 250 years since the advent of the industrial revolution, is remaking the whole concept of what the energy industry is. It can be in the small. Kenyan communication technologies, allied with highly entrepreneurial business models, are addressing the energy access challenge in Eastern Africa in ways nobody would have believed possible. They partly perhaps go to your predictive point about solar. It's not just energy, it's because a lot of the access issue is around finding the right financial capacity rather than just the issue of technology. So the technologies, you know them: artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, big data, predictive analytics tied to it, large-scale dissemination of sensors and almost immediate actuation, not requiring human interference, as it were. Machine learning, the Internet of People being succeeded by the Internet of Things, and we could go on with other elements of it. But the critical point is it's the putting together of these different elements of these new technology that is vastly changing the nature of the industry. And as much as we focus, as we need to, on sustainability elements and the role of decarbonization, on the other side, we're looking at much cheaper and perhaps much more abundant energy being made available at lower costs, holding much more promise, addressing the access issue to the 1.5 billion people or so who don't have it. I think thirdly, we need to recognize that we've got a major shift in both the center of gravity of economic activity towards Asia, widen that up a bit, particularly in the next generation. And in fact, beyond the 2060, in the last part of the century, almost certainly towards Africa. It's another issue. This set of, there are other elements, but essentially this set of forecastable elements are generally critical for just about everything we do, and not just the energy industry. And those technologies will remake, as they have historically in the earlier phases of the industrial, will remake the demand side for energy as much as they open up new options on the supply side. This set of certainties, in a way, we call the grand transition. And the grand transition affects all industry. But what are the critical uncertainties which will shape the particular pathways we choose? How well will we as human species be capable of addressing the new challenges that we have, particularly from these new tools and techniques? The first one is, what is going to be the pace of innovation? Will we be able to handle potentially significant displacement of people from jobs or not? And if so, what will be the political ramifications and the issues that surround that? I think secondly, we come to the issue of the environment, not just the climate change issue. We look at many studies out there, there are at least 9 fairly fundamental and critical environmental issues, of which decarbonization is but one. There are nitrogen, phosphorus cycle issues, which affect perhaps agriculture. There are plastics issue and its dissemination. There are emergent issues around water stress, maybe not be the global issue, but in some regions it is the issue. So what will be the nature and form of the collective portfolio of environmental challenges that we choose to address? Will we thirdly have the capacity to build a global governance system which will be able to ensure we can get collective ownership of these problems? Or are we going to be going our own way, as some politicians drive people, perhaps in the context of an inability to create adequate jobs, into a different world? So there are an infinite number of scenarios. So what leads us to these 3? Each, as you'll see, I always like music, but each with a different musical genre to give you a sense of the mood and the behind this. You've got all sorts of sums and so on. But there are 3 here. One is modern jazz, market-driven approach, individual access, affordability of energy. This is a low-cost energy world, enormous variety, market mechanisms, technology innovation, energy access for all. But it must have the capacity to deal with inequality. It's got a whole set of internal stresses and strains which are challenging. It may be that they're so strong, the stresses and strains, that we end up in hard rock. It's a jarring set of sounds, it's challenging, it's dark at times. It's about a world that's moving much more to national perspectives. It's a world where energy security is a fundamental issue, and it tends to overtake sustainability concerns. It's about fragmented policies locally. It's about the emphasis on local content, best fit solutions. And there are examples around the world, which I won't mention, where you can see this phenomena in play. And lastly, unfinished symphony. You could say the Paris Accords, because they've not yet solved the problem of how we get to 2 degrees centigrade, although we have maps, is a good example of an unfinished symphony. More needs to be done. But this is about collective ownership of a problem. This is working together. It's about a positive extension of the international governance system. It's about working through the valuing of a long-term vision and plan, continually updated. It's about unified climate action, and therefore it's a different world. 3 worlds. So let me just conclude here. Why would we do this sort of effort? Well, we do it because policymakers would like to understand the worlds they're going to be in. They like to understand the challenges that they face. In large companies, people want to develop strategies that are responsive to the world as it's likely to be. You don't have to solve the problems from here to 2060, but you do need to think clearly about where you're going to go. If you're investing in an energy project that will take 10 years or maybe more to come to fruition. So let me just leave you there and reflect on what I've said, and we can perhaps discuss your own thoughts and how we go forward. Thank you.
There's lots of things buzzing around inside the head, so we'll get to some of those questions very shortly. But just to begin, just to try and summarize some of the ideas that we've been talking about. Thank you, Deb, very much for that presentation. I think it summarized a lot of things that we've been saying. I'll just have on here, trying to deal with the microphone. So one of the first questions mainly is to sort of summarize all of this together is how much do forecasters, that'd be a cheeky question, how much do forecasters value the forecast of others? So there, as we've said, there are a great many forecasted scenarios and different things out there, all of use cases in various situations. Perhaps when you make a particular scenario, you have a set of given assumptions, you have a given set of ideas that you put inside that scenario, and someone else is using a different set of assumptions. Now, those different assumptions, would you say that they're somehow potentially less correct than the forecast that you're creating yourself, or the scenario you're creating yourself, or are they just as complementary? Do they all help to add to the discussion? Are they all useful? And under what situations are they useful? I think that's probably a good point to start this particular session. So we don't have to go in any particular order. If anyone here would like to comment on this to begin with, anyone particularly? Joe, yeah? I'll just turn on sure.
Thank you. You actually asked about. You actually, I think, asked about 10 questions in there. So I think we all touched on the fact that scenarios are produced to inform debate. And so, yes, we do. We at Shell, and I think all of us would agree, we value the forecasts of, or the scenarios of others. By talking with others, you inform your own thinking about the future. So I think it's hugely important, and you touched on it, I think, that we understand what a scenario was intended for. So we understand whether it was an open-ended scenario, we understand whether it's a normative scenario, we understand what the organisation that developed it wanted to do. So if I look at, the CCC in the UK, the CCC developed scenarios to prove possible pathways to meet the climate change targets. National Grid produces scenarios. Theirs are more around, they want to understand the future of the gas and the electricity networks and the options for that. In Shell with Sky, we set out to prove a global scenario that could deliver a 2 degrees C world and look at what the consequences of that were. And ultimately with that one, we said, well, whereas, if you like, mountains was a world with government push, and oceans required societal push. Sky was an and world. It required both to work together very hard. So it allows us, in that respect, those scenarios allow Shell to be able to sort of enter that debate more, with more credibility about what is required and what we're going to need to see for the transition to happen. But simply, yes, we do value the work of others. And underlying assumptions, well, we've talked about that, there's loads and loads of uncertainty. So we will have different assumptions. You made a really good point about getting the experts around the assumptions, working with the models. So I'll hand over to you to say a bit more about it.
And I would just ask at this point as well, I mean, if we do say that these forecasts are all complementary, is there such thing, or is there such thing as a forecast that's not useful? And where do you draw that line? What sort of thing do you listen to and where do you not listen to it as well? But that's, I suppose, can kind of get into that.
Well, to a bit resound what I'm saying, I think the question is incomplete because it's useful for what purpose? I think you can say for strategic thinking and having kind of very broad, open discussions about the future, all the forecasts are useful, especially when you kind of have a very superficial surface level can compare them. Because that's what currently, as an outsider, like if you're a producer of the scenarios, you can call upon like a lot of knowledge behind them. If you're kind of an outsider, you have to be lucky enough to get a little bit of time from somebody working at Shell to explain it to you. And that's not what the purpose is. So I think if it's really for like these broad discussions, I think they're all useful. If it's for making calls on okay, what buttons should a certain government department push on housing in the UK, they're not useful at all in the current state at all, I think. And they're also not intended necessarily, even though I think a lot of academics would like them to be intended for that purpose. They're not intended for that purpose, at least from my experience with like government departments. They do their own in-house stuff for that, and they like to work like with a very diligent, due diligence procedure. And when you're talking about like understanding demand side relevant actions, I think they're incomplete. But that's, I think we overly focus on technology supply side. We don't really talk about what first makes innovations happen. It's not a technology element as such, but I'll talk more about that later.
Sure, thank you. And Jed, did you have any points or anything?
I think the first thing is you generally don't get up in the morning and just think these are the global problems. A lot of the work you do is done in a country, it's done in maybe a city, it's done at a level where there's a lot of specific issues. So there's always interest in having a look at comparable work locally, whatever local is. Secondly, I think personally, I'm much less interested in forecasts than I am interested in insight. So I value enormously people who, for one reason or another, have a way of thinking about certain problems, which is special. I go back to your first picture. As somebody who I've always liked a lot, probably may or may not be known here, is Cesare Marchetti. Cesare Marchetti worked at the International Institute of Life Systems Analysis. And he was very much looked at this long journey of the energy system from high carbon content to hydrogen, and really plotting, a really very interesting set of insights, which are probably as true 30 years on from having done that work as they were when he first conceived it. So I think insight matters. Also, insight which is not necessarily directly in the energy sector. It's about the context of the energy sector. You can see, I mean, for our recent survey of scenarios, I showed you actually the set. One of the most interesting issues there is not whether somebody has this or that forecast. It's what did they talk about and what did they not talk about. So decarbonisation, digitalisation, we've got a whole bunch of Ds, demography, democratisation, could be others. There are others we've got it. So what are the broad macro trend drivers which are part and parcel of a collective set of conversations. Which ones do people ignore? Which don't? Sometimes you ignore things you can't easily quantify. They may be very important. So I think, yeah, other people's work's always important. How do you value it? Well, I leave each one of you to think about how you do. Is it because they work for a particular organization? They're in a particular organization? Is it because they've got a new set of tools? That's always interesting. Shall we say, as a practitioner, I'm interested in ideas, and I'm interested in techniques, process, and that for me is a continual search and interesting. Never assume you know everything. 99% of the best ideas are outside your organization and not in. Which makes it fun. It's a lot of learning to be done.
Yes, and you sort of sense that. And it's what I have at my end there. And I suppose moving on from that particular question then, when many of us will be chemical engineers in the room. So when we're looking, particularly in the context of future energy, really driving towards that sensible energy future, in what sense could forecasts and scenarios help us define that then, I suppose, for our particular context?
I'll kick off and then I'll pass. Let me give you the most extreme situation of really making sense of a broad range of scenarios. Well, I was involved with the IPCC's SRES scenario 15 years ago, 16, 17 years. And there we deliberately, and then in subsequent IPCC reports you'll see, we searched for every damn scenario that was virtually ever made and developed a family, developed enormous fan scenario. As one of the input documents to try and understand where, a little bit like what you were doing, to try to understand where the new path, how the new pathways would fit in against everything that's done. And why was that done? I think it was to show that there had been a lot of thinking about what others had done. Now, this is enormously dangerous. People produce scenarios for all sorts of reasons. On the other hand, there is a desire to have a sense of completeness comparing what you have. I think what is interesting is when you look at scenarios done broadly within the same context, at around about the same time, to see how different the futures are. Because we continually learn, as you pointed out, when you look at solar prediction, I'm not sure where you got it from, but as you can see, the one thing you can be sure about most scenarios is their view of the future. It's a projection of where we are today in most cases. And scenarios tomorrow will be a projection of where we are tomorrow.
Yeah, did you have any further comments, Joe?
I think it's really, to some extent, it's repeating what I said earlier and building what Jen said, that it is hugely important to understand why the organisation or the set of scenarios you're looking at, the forecast was made. And that helps you to understand what is relevant to take from that, the insights that you want to take from that. But yeah, all organisations have their biases. They start in a particular position. They will see different issues. I think you made the point about, what is the what if question you're trying to answer. Some will turn out to be relevant. Again, I look back at, it's quite intriguing to look back at scenarios from 10 or 15 years ago and see what they said. Shell was predicting a huge uptake of hydrogen vehicles. Now, in terms of the number of ULEZ vehicles, it probably was actually quite a good view, but at the moment it's the wrong vehicle. But, it doesn't really matter. It was still saying there needs to be a big uptake of the electric vehicles. But I think one of the problems we struggle with forecasting or making scenarios, and especially for engineers, and if I make a derogatory comment about engineers, I'm an engineer too, but as an engineer, we like to have numbers. We like everything to work out numerically, and of course we're very focused on the best techno-economic solution, and most models will give us a techno-economic analysis, but really, the outcome is about what people want. It's about what society desires, and it's about when society makes changes, and that is not
easy to predict. And therefore, I think that's one of the reasons why scenarios work so much better than forecasts, because it's black swan things that can happen.
Yeah, I'd like to add kind of two perspectives in the webinar as well. I'm going to use the microphone. Let's keep trying.
Sounds good. I think one thing to look at if you're looking at scenario reports is they're kind of small, for me, looking at different scenarios, talking about like oil company produced scenarios, NGO produced scenarios, institutional sscenarios, World Energy Council. There's small things that you can pick up, which for me tell if it's relevant or not. And one of the things, for instance, is that ExxonMobil, they're not in the room, so I can really comment here. For instance, lumps together wind and solar still in a scenario. And this is something which means that it's not on their radar at all, and it's not seen as a relevant thing because they're as different as oil is from gas or from coal. So if you're lumping up together and it's not possible to kind of, in their data set, they produce a data set associated with the scenario, but it's not separated out, it tells you a story of what the thinking is behind that scenario. I think there are lots of small things that you can pick up as an outsider, even which tell you something about how useful is this scenario going to be for me to know anything about renewables. Well, not relevant. It's probably pretty good to know something about oil markets, gas markets, and coal markets because they're some of the biggest experts in the world in that field. If you believe in a world that will mostly be influenced and powered by fossil fuels. So I think that's one thing, it's like small things you can pick up which give you some kind of quick clue. And the other part is, I think this returns to Joanna's point on the kind of engineering perspective, is that I think scenario makers don't enough emphasize that technology innovation is inherently disruptive. What I mean with that is that there are always forces in society that try to keep things as they are up to a certain point. And the best example of this is that only when something is demonstrated to work, and not just on a technical level, but also within a market setting and accepted by people, will you see a much faster acceleration. And I think that is not enough, at least in the academic world, in the mindset of scenario builders, that you don't have people use these learning curves and then they set a parameter. That's not disruptive. A learning curve in itself is like a smooth learning curve which has a certain space of acceleration. The pace of acceleration will have a break, and then we'll have another break, and we'll have another break. And to make these scenarios more relevant, we kind of need to figure out what are the what-if points where suddenly you get a jump of technology acceleration by 5% additional from one year to the other.
Okay, great, fantastic. I'm just looking at the time now, and we will probably have to go to audience questions. If you can make this point just very briefly so we can get to some.
I just wanted to pick up the work on the future of hydrogen, picking up disruption. One of the reasons you didn't see massive fuel cell development, diversification, is that one of the preconditions of the work was that we were looking at a factor of 10 increase in the economics of fuel cells. Once you take that, you can then remake the world. And that scenario, which was published in 2002, was seen as one route to addressing the climate change issue, allowing coal to be developed in China in the northeast, and at the same time put CO2 on the ground. So you can be very innovative about these things. The challenge, of course, is knowing how quickly you can move in the case of fuel cells, along with nanotechnology applications for hydrogen storage and so on. So it's kind of whether they will come about. So that's the flip side. If you're conservative, it's easy. If you want to be really innovative in thinking through, I think the team who did that was, you're making some really big assumptions on technology.
Yeah, understood. Well raised. Okay, I think we'll go back to the audience now. I'm not sure if we want to start with a question from the room. If we've got one to start, I'm just looking at the time, we've got like 10 minutes left of questions, so we'll try and, if you can direct them to an individual speaker, that would be useful at the start, just to keep things relatively concise.
Good evening, Professor Shaw from Imperial College Energy Futures Lab. I was very intrigued by the inspiration for this panel discussion from the Bloomberg New Energy Finance's blog, where the writer suggested very strongly that, as well as bemoaning the sort of the lack of accuracy, the outturn of many forecasts, he basically went on to say, if you're not going to make a very good forecast, then you shouldn't be publishing it. I'd be very, very interested to hear how the panel reacts to that sort of view with regard to forecast, because what we've heard so far is a very different philosophy with regard to the value of forecasts.
Would you like to direct that question at anyone in particular? Just to start, choose the sort of begin.
I'll let them decide.
Sure.
Well, if it's me because I have the microphone, then none of us talked about making forecasts, because we all think that if you make forecasts, you'll be wrong. I suppose, yeah, Bloomberg were actually saying we did such a great job in a way, weren't they? We predicted the uptake of solar. Yeah, I went back to the work that Jed did. It was not far off actually on the levels of solar, but they over-predicted wind. So well, they didn't predict it at all because it wasn't a prediction. But you know, forecasts will always be wrong. You know, we're not trying to say that they're right. We're not trying to say that one is better than another. The important thing is what insights can you take from the work that was done? What can you learn from it? And you have to apply your own brain in this when you're reading them. You have to apply your own thinking rather than just take something as a given.
Sure.
Let me just be very concrete on this. That work has similar work out to 2060. Was really to help people better understand the R&D possibilities and what sort of technologies might play a very significant role 40 years out, 50 years out. That's immensely interesting discussion we had when we put together a significant research program which will explore new areas where the company can move into, or in the case of government, direction for the research establishments that it has. And I think at that time, and I'm sure subsequently, you can have a very intelligent discussion with, at that time, the Department of Trade and Industry in the UK, but with research groups around the world. The second issue, which is important, and you take an oil and gas company, is resource acquisition. You're buying resources with the intention of having a portfolio that you can develop over decades going ahead. Now, will we need oil and gas decades? So these long-term, this long-term work doesn't have to be totally accurate. I'll just conclude with one point, which is an odd point. My own view is that if you do this work and you lead this work, then you need almost to take a Hippocratic oath. You have an absolute condition to be as honest to the work as possible. That isn't to say it won't get distorted in many different ways. But if you are not being honest in the way the work is done, then you're fooling everybody else that you're doing the work for. So that's important. What does it tell us? That we can change over time. It's because we're human. We learn new things. And that learning at some point pushes us to reconfigure and reconceptualize. Is that a bad thing? I think not. I think that's one of the great pleasures of life, to be involved in that rethinking and reconceptualization. And what this foresight work does is give you that chance.
Yeah, just moving on so we can get some other questions. Was there perhaps one for the webinar? Could we just bring the microphone to the front and we can...
Thank you very much. So I've got a question from Olivia Namfuga. Apologies if I mispronounced that. Online. How do the subsidies on fossil fuels contribute to the uncertainty in forecasting? And how is this being considered during scenarios that are being built?
Sure. And did we nominate a particular recipient for the question? No, okay. All right. Well, would anyone feel particularly strong?
I think it hardly depends on, like, you can't say about, I think this is part of the discussion, you can't say these scenarios being built because it will highly depend on which institute and what their starting point is. Now, for instance, the International Energy Agency has a whole database that you can actually totally access on policies, which they update every year as a starting point for their projections. I think they have about, for each country, have several hundred, so like a database of like 5,000 to 10,000 policies in place, and they form parameters in their model. So that's one way where it will have quite a big influence over time for certain countries, especially countries like Egypt, which has recently changed, Iran, and so on, how their energy mix will develop over time. Now, how it is in other scenarios, that will be very different because they might not work on this kind of specific, like you have a lot of knobs and you can change all of them perspective.
Yeah, sure.
I think there's actually a broader question in there about policy and how does policy impact the outcome? Because we wouldn't have seen the rapid uptake of solar if it hadn't been supported by strong policy for a decade previously. And the same goes, you mentioned why haven't we seen CCS take off? Well, there's no policy support. So I think to some extent, policy clearly has a massive impact on the resulting energy system, and that's partly why it's very hard to, if you like, make, for any forecast or scenario to eventuate. But we mustn't forget it's also not just about policy and what governments do, but it's also about what society wants. Because if society really, really wanted us to meet climate change goals, if society was really driving towards that, we'd see it in political debate. And so it would go up the political agenda, and we'd see far more policies in the UK that supported the transition, and perhaps that we'd see policies in countries that withdrew subsidies as well. But we're not seeing enough, I think, societal pull for change.
Sure. Yeah, good answers. Do we have any more questions from the floor? I think we're probably going to wrap up, so maybe will be the last one. Sure, yeah, to the gentleman in the back. If you just kindly say your name and your organisation as you've had so far.
James Hughes, I work independently. I don't want to commit suicide. I'm just a member of the human race, and all the birds and the bees and everything also are too. I really do think we do need to stick to the well below 2 degrees centigrade. I'm wondering whether the price of carbon would have any bearing on the ability or the decision to change behaviour. We need leaders. I think the forecasters are going to be great role for that.
Sure. And would we like to do that question to anyone in specific? Or?
I think Joe.
Sure. Okay.
So Shell has always been an advocate for a carbon price. Carbon price is the easiest way, if you like, to make sure that we decarbonise the economy in the most efficient way across all the sectors. And we can see in the UK that a modest carbon price, the carbon floor price, has been very effective in helping us switch from coal to gas. And so in our power sector is now very much lower in carbon content than it was not that long ago, and our emissions reduction is one of the best in the developed world in the UK because of a relatively modest carbon price. But we're not going to get a global carbon price anytime soon, so sort of continuing to sort of ask that and see that's the primary driver isn't going to get us there. So we have to find other means, whether it's because technology's just become affordable anyway, and they don't need a carbon price, and that's fantastic news, but we don't need to have subsidies, or we don't need support mechanisms, or just because people are prepared to pay a bit more for something that's new and they like as well. I mean, we'll all buy an iPhone when it costs twice as much as a phone that essentially has the same functionality. We're reaching the point where people will buy an electric car because they like it. It's something that we don't have a direct association between price and product. We buy something we like, even though it's more expensive than something that would serve our needs. And I think when we see energy in that way, then we'll see more change happen as well.
I think on the carbon price debates as well, there's probably, I think a lot of that actually was drawn from our efforts to repair the ozone layer. looking at the emissions of fluorocarbons from refrigerants and things. And there was sort of an idea that pricing carbon the same way that the refrigerants problem you solved would be much more, well, it would be a solution that would work relatively easily. And unfortunately, because the refrigerants problem only have 25 actors or so producing all this stuff and using it, whereas with carbon, you end up looking at the outputs of tailpipes and industry and all over the world. There's thousands of people involved. It's a significantly higher problem. So carbon price, I think, yes, it's always been a great thing to have. It's just it's been difficult getting there. I think it would be fantastic if we did get there, and we would probably all want one. But yeah. And in any case, I think we probably need to sum up now. So if Clara, you would like to come up with some concluding remarks for us and just give us something to take home.
Sarah, thank you.
Okay, well, I'm sorry there wasn't that much time for questions, but yeah, I think from the webinar and also from here in the room, I mean, we can maybe pass them on later, or there will be some time also to close the speakers afterwards. So yeah, first, like, join me in thanking our panelists and our speakers today. Yeah, I think we've just tried today to push the debate forward a little bit and yeah, get some ideas and stir our thinking on this topic. And I think we've done that with the help of our panelists quite well. I think so. I've tried to just take a couple notes through the discussion as some key takeaway messages, and please add some if I missed them at the end. So I think one of the points that everyone raised was, at least the panelists here, we're not actually doing forecasts, we're doing scenarios. And scenarios is what will help us sort of get an understanding of how transitions can happen and will help us sort of, yeah, navigate in this space. They're useful. We can identify certain aspects that are forecastable and others that are not, and we have to be able to differentiate between those two. I think the other thing that I've identified as a recurrent topic was that there is a need for transparency and honesty on what is underpinning those scenarios, on the assumptions, the inputs, the methods, and so on, and also to know that there is inherent bias in all of those scenarios that are presented, and to understand what was the intention behind those scenarios. So to really dig deeper there. And then the third point that I think came out was that this energy transition, I guess, is a large and a collective issue that is influenced by societal desires and needs and policy and so on, and we have to see it as such. And maybe a bit counterintuitive for engineers, it's more about the insights and not so much about the hard numbers, but really just seeing trends and sort of understanding that. Yeah, one quote that I liked from Joe at the end just said, well, we have to apply our own brains and our own thinking when we look at those scenarios. So is there anything I missed terribly? Okay, we'll keep it with this. So yeah, I think we've only managed to touch on a small number of aspects, but nevertheless, I think it was an interesting debate and a nice evening. So there'll be some refreshments outside. We can gather around a bit and continue the discussion, at least for the people here in London, and for the people on the webinar, I'll say good night and goodbye. So yeah.